People think the scariest places are the ones that are obviously scary. You know, abandoned asylums, old cemeteries, houses where something terrible happened. There's a comfort in that, I think. It means horror is supposed to stay in its lane. But the most disturbing thing, the thing that's truly followed me, didn't happen in a place like that. It happened in the most beautiful, perfect, sun-drenched cabin you could ever imagine, on a summer vacation that was supposed to be the highlight of our year. It's not a story about a ghost or a monster. It's a story about a guestbook. And it's the reason I'll never rent a stranger's house again. It was the summer after my freshman year of college. My parents, in a desperate attempt to pry me and my younger brother, Leo, away from our screens, booked a week at a place called Serenity Pines. The pictures online were incredible. A gorgeous, rustic A-frame cabin on a secluded lake surrounded by miles of forest. No neighbors. No noise. Just family time. Leo, who was 15, complained about the promised lack of Wi-Fi, and I was mostly annoyed about leaving my friends, but even I had to admit the place was stunning when we arrived. It was perfect, almost aggressively perfect. The wooden floors gleamed. A welcome basket with artisanal cheese and a bottle of wine sat on the kitchen counter. The beds were made with crisp, white linens that smelled like sunshine. My mom was practically in tears of joy. "See," she said, beaming. "This is what we needed." On the little coffee table in the living room, there was a leather-bound guestbook. I've always been a sucker for things like that. I love seeing the little traces of the people who were here before, their little snippets of happiness. I opened it up. The first few pages were filled with glowing reviews in bubbly, cheerful handwriting. The Miller family, July 20, taught us the perfect escape. We fished, we swam, we roasted s'mores every night. Little Timmy caught his first bass. We feel so refreshed, can't wait to come back. The Davidson Party, August 2024, a truly magical week. The sunsets over the lake are breathtaking. We recommend the hiking trail to Eagle Point. A perfect 10 out of 10. I read a few more aloud to my family. It was charming. It was exactly the kind of wholesome, idyllic experience my parents were hoping for. For the first 2 days, we lived it. We really did. Dad and Leo actually went fishing. Mom and I read books on the dock. We even, God help us, did a jigsaw puzzle. It was a simulation of a perfect family vacation, and we were all playing our parts beautifully. The first crack in the facade was tiny. It was on the third day. I was bored, flipping through the guestbook again, and I noticed something odd. The Davidsons were there in August 2024. The next entry was from the Garza family, also in August 2024. The dates they listed overlapped by 3 days. I pointed it out to my dad. "That's weird," I said. He just shrugged. "Probably just a typo. Someone wrote the wrong month." It was a logical explanation. I accepted it. But it planted a tiny, itchy seed of wrongness in the back of my mind. The next thing was the coffee. My mom is a huge coffee snob. There's only one specific, slightly obscure brand of dark roast from a small company in Oregon that she'll drink. She'd brought her own, of course. But on the fourth morning, she opened a kitchen cupboard she hadn't looked in yet and just froze. Inside was a brand new, unopened bag of that exact same coffee. "Well, that's an incredible coincidence," she said, her voice a little shaky. My dad just laughed it off. "Great hosts, I guess. But it wasn't just a coincidence. It was information they couldn't have known. We were 150 miles from the nearest place that even sold that brand. The feeling of being catered to started to feel less like good hospitality and more like being observed. The breaking point, ironically, was the Wi-Fi. It was barely functional, just like the listing promised. Leo was going insane, and honestly, so was I. I told my dad I was going to find the router and try resetting it. I'm the designated tech support in our family. I looked in all the usual places, closets, behind the TV, and found nothing. Finally, in the back of the linen closet, behind a stack of musty, smelling towels, I saw it. A small, square panel in the wall, painted the same color as the wood, almost perfectly camouflaged. I pried it open with my fingernails. It wasn't just a router. My blood went cold. It was a complex web of electronics that had no business being in a rental cabin. There was a router, yes, but it was connected to multiple hard drives, signal splitters, and a mess of coaxial cables that snaked off into the walls in every direction. It was a professional-grade, closed-circuit surveillance system. My hands were shaking. I closed the panel, my heart hammering in my chest. "You're overreacting," I told myself. "It's for security. But you don't point security cameras inside the house. Not in the bedrooms. Not in the bathrooms." I pulled out my phone. I remembered reading an article about how to find hidden cameras. You turn off all the lights, turn on your phone's front-facing camera, the one without an infrared filter, and scan the room. The camera lenses will reflect the infrared light and show up as little points of light on your screen. I waited until my family was down at the dock. I went into the living room, drew all the curtains, and turned off the lights. The room was plunged into darkness. I held up my phone and started scanning. Nothing. I felt a wave of relief. I was being paranoid. I was about to turn the lights back on when I pointed my phone up at the ceiling. And there it was. A tiny, winking purple dot in the center of the smoke detector. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I nearly threw up. The smoke detector had a perfect, panoramic view of the entire living room. The couch where we'd sat, the table where we'd done the puzzle. Everything. I ran to my parents' bedroom. I found one almost immediately, a tiny pinhole in the face of the digital alarm clock on the nightstand. Then I went to the bathroom. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. I scanned the walls, the mirror, the ceiling, nothing. Then I pointed it at the shower head. A tiny, malevolent purple dot winked back at me from one of the nozzles. Someone had been watching us in our most private, vulnerable moments. The violation of it was a physical blow. It felt like a stranger was living under my skin. I stumbled back into the living room, my mind racing. The Guestbook. It was still sitting on the table. It wasn't just a book. It was a prop. It was part of the set. I snatched it up and started reading it again, but now the cheerful words were dripping with a sinister new meaning. Little Timmy caught his first bass! We recommend the hiking trail to Eagle Point. They weren't diary entries. They were staged directions. They were lines in a play. These families hadn't just been on vacation. They had been performing. And the overlapping dates weren't a typo. It was proof that the timeline was fake, a fiction created for the audience. And the audience was whoever was on the other side of those cameras. I flipped towards the back of the book, past all the entries. The last dozen pages were blank, except for one. The very last page. There was a new entry, written in a beautiful, flowing script that was a perfect, chilling imitation of my mother's handwriting. My blood turned to ice. It was dated for 2 days from now, the day we were scheduled to leave. The Wallace family, August 28th, 2025. What a wonderful, peaceful week! We couldn't have asked for a better getaway. Jenna loved swimming in the lake. Leo finally caught his first fish, and we all feel so much closer as a family. The cabin was perfect in every way. We can't wait to come back. Every single detail was a lie. I hated swimming in the murky lake water, and Leo hadn't caught a single fish. He'd given up after 20 minutes. This wasn't a prediction. It was the script. It was the happy ending that had been written for us, the final entry we were supposed to make before the credits rolled. The philosophical horror of it crashed down on me. We weren't guests, we were subjects. We were lab rats in a sick experiment about manufacturing the perfect family vacation. And the most terrifying question in the world bloomed in my mind: what happens to the actors when the show is over? What happened to the Millers, and the Davidsons, and the Garcias? The Guestbook was full, but the woods were empty. I ran down to the dock, trying to act casual, my mind screaming, "Mom, Dad, Leo, I have to show you something. It's important." Getting them to believe me was the hardest part. They were so invested in the illusion of perfection. Jenna, don't be ridiculous. Hidden cameras. You've been watching too many movies. But when I made them come inside, when I turned off the lights and showed them the purple dot in the smoke detector, their denial crumbled. I've never seen my father look so scared. My mom started to cry, silent tears streaming down her face as she understood the violation. We had to get out, but we couldn't just run. Whoever was watching would know something was wrong. We had to follow the script. My dad, his voice trembling slightly, announced, "Hey everyone, I've got an idea! Why don't we pack a small bag and get an early start tomorrow for a day trip to see the falls?" It was a brilliant piece of improv. The next hour was the most terrifying of my life. We moved through the cabin, packing essentials into a single backpack, all while pretending to have a normal family evening. We laughed too loudly. We made small talk about the weather. We were acting for our lives, keenly aware of the silent, invisible eyes that were judging our performance. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to hold a figure. When we were ready, we walked out the front door, leaving most of our stuff behind. We got in the car. Dad put the key in the ignition. For one heart-stopping second, I was sure it wouldn't start, that this was the part of the script where the car breaks down. But the engine turned over. We pulled away, driving slowly at first, then faster, kicking up a cloud of dust as we tore down the long gravel driveway. No one spoke. We just watched the rearview mirror, waiting for the headlights of a car to appear behind us. But nothing came. We drove for 2 hours before we stopped. We called the police from a gas station. We told them everything. They took it seriously. But by the time a patrol car managed to find the remote cabin the next day, it was empty. Not just of us, but of everything. The surveillance equipment was gone. The welcome basket was gone. The guestbook was gone. The cabin was just a clean, empty, beautiful house. The online listing we'd used had vanished. The owner was a ghost. There was no proof anything had ever happened. Except for us, we know. I still have nightmares about it. Not about being attacked, but about being watched. About the feeling that my happiest memories might not be my own. That my life is just a performance for some unseen audience. Because the truly disturbing thing, the horror that this story leaves you with, is not knowing where the stage ends and the real world begins. You've heard a story about a place that was built to be a trap. The horror in that cabin was premeditated. It was the work of a thinking, malicious human mind. That's a terrifying thought, but it's a familiar kind of terror. We understand human evil. We have names for it. But the second account I have for you is, to my mind, infinitely more disturbing. Because the horror wasn't built by anyone. It was ancient, it was natural, and it had no malice in it at all. It was simply hungry, and what it fed on was the very idea of you. My name is Dr. Alistair Finch. I'm a marine biologist, and this is the story of what's waiting in the water at Silver Sands. My field is microbial oceanography, specifically the study of extremophiles and parasitic organisms. I seek out life in places it shouldn't exist: volcanic vents, subglacial lakes, and highly saline environments. I am, by trade, a man who believes in explainable, observable phenomena. I mention this because I need you to understand that I did not go to the coves at Silver Sands looking for a monster. I went there following a data anomaly. Silver Sands is a pristine stretch of coastline, famous for its white beaches and crystal clear water. It's a vacationer's paradise. But for decades, it's had a strange, quiet reputation. People would go missing, not in the dramatic, headline-grabbing way. They would simply wander off. A college student on a camping trip would be found weeks later, miles down the coast, dehydrated, and with no memory of who he was. A husband on his honeymoon would walk away from his new wife and be discovered living in a shelter 2 towns over a placid, smiling blank slate. The local authorities called them psychotic breaks, fugue states brought on by stress or some unknown trigger. But there were too many of them. It was a statistical cluster, and that gets people like me interested. I secured a small grant and set up a temporary lab in a rented cottage a few miles from the main beach. My official purpose was to study the unique local ecosystem. My unofficial purpose was to figure out why happy people on vacation were walking away from their lives. I spent the first few weeks conducting standard surveys. Water salinity, temperature, local flora and fauna. Everything was perfectly normal. The local fishermen I spoke to were wary. They told me stories, dismissed as local folklore, about the placid ones. They said that sometimes the ocean gives you back someone who looks like the person you lost, but their soul has been rinsed clean. It was poetic nonsense, but it was a clue. I decided to focus my search on the more remote parts of the coastline, the areas the tourists rarely visited. It was on the 4th week that I found the tide pool. It was located in a small, almost perfectly circular cove, hidden from the main beach by a treacherous barrier of black, volcanic rock. You could only get to it at low tide. The place felt sterile. The surrounding rocks were bare, with none of the usual barnacles or sea moss. The sand was a fine, silvery powder, and the pool itself was breathtaking. It was about 30 feet across and maybe 10 feet deep in the center, a perfect bowl of the clearest water I had ever seen. There was no seaweed, no algae, not a single visible fish or crab. As a biologist, that was a blaring alarm. A body of water this seemingly perfect should be teeming with life. An absence of life is often a sign of something toxic. I was about to take a sample when I heard voices. A young couple, clearly tourists, had navigated the rocks and stumbled into the cove. They were laughing, full of life. They saw the pool and their jaws dropped. "It's like something out of a movie," the woman said. Before I could warn them about taking a dip in untested waters, they had their shoes off and were wading in. I decided to stay back, to observe. This was an opportunity. They didn't swim, just sat in the shallow water, letting it lap around them. Their laughter slowly died down, replaced by a comfortable, peaceful silence. They stayed for nearly an hour. When they left, their energy seemed softer, more subdued. They walked past my hiding spot without even noticing me, their expressions placid and content. I made them my unofficial case study. I'll call them Mark and Sarah. I saw them again the next day, heading back to the cove. I approached them on the main beach under the guise of a tourist survey. They were bright, articulate, and excited about their vacation. They had plans to go hiking, kayaking, and visit a local winery. That was day 1. I spoke to them again on day 3. They had visited the tide pool every day. The change was subtle but profound. Their energetic plans were gone. "We might go hiking tomorrow," Mark said, with no real conviction. but it's just so peaceful down at that little beach. We might just hang out there." Sarah, who had been so talkative on day one, just smiled and nodded. Her vibrant personality seemed to have been sanded down, leaving a smooth, pleasant surface. By day 5, the transformation was nearly complete. I found them sitting on the sand by the tide pool, not talking, not touching, just staring at the water with faint, serene smiles. Their skin had taken on a pale, waxy sheen, and their eyes, while clear, seemed to lack focus. They looked like perfect, beautiful, life-sized dolls. I knelt beside them. "Mark, Sarah, how are you two feeling?" Mark turned his head slowly. "We're good," he said, his voice a soft monotone. "Everything's good. It's so calm here. What about that winery you wanted to visit?" I prodded. He seemed to search for the memory. "The winery," he repeated, as if the word had no meaning. "No. This is better. This is simple." That was the word. Simple. Their complex, vibrant, human personalities had been distilled down to a single, simple state of being. Placid contentment. They were the placid ones. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. That night I went back to the tide pool during low tide, armed with my collection kit. Under the moonlight, I saw something I hadn't noticed in the day. The water had a faint, internal luminescence, a soft, milky blue glow that seemed to pulse with a slow, steady rhythm. I took my sample and rushed back to my lab. What I saw under the microscope is the reason I no longer sleep soundly. The water was not sterile. It was saturated with a microorganism unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't a bacteria or a protozoa or an archaea. It was a crystalline lattice-like structure, almost like a snowflake, that was pulsing with its own soft, blue light. When I introduced a drop of nutrient solution, the lattices didn't multiply by dividing. They extended, connecting with each other, forming a larger, more complex network. It was a single, colonial organism that behaved like a biological computer, like a neural net. I spent the next 48 hours running frantic tests. The organism was a neuroparasite. It entered the host through the skin, through osmosis. It didn't feed on blood or tissue. It fed on bioelectric impulses, on the synaptic firings of the brain. It didn't kill its host. It integrated with it. It would latch onto the host's neural pathways, absorbing memories, emotions, and personality traits as if they were data. And in return, it would flood the host's system with powerful neuroinhibitors and endorphins, effectively replacing the complex tapestry of human consciousness with a simple, blissful, placid state. The philosophical horror of my discovery was paralyzing. This wasn't a predator that killed you. It was a predator that edited you. It erased the book of your life and left the cover, a perfect-looking but utterly empty vessel. The person was gone, but the body remained, a walking shell whose only new purpose was to feel content, to stay near the source, and perhaps, on some primitive level, to encourage others to experience its peace. I went back for one last conversation with Mark and Sarah. It was the day they were supposed to check out of their hotel. I found them, as I knew I would, sitting by the tide pool. "It's time to go home, isn't it?" I asked gently. Sarah looked at me, her smile never wavering. "We are home," she said, her voice soft as the lapping water. "What about your families?" I asked. "Your jobs? Your lives back in the city?" Mark gestured at the pool. "That was the other place, the noisy place. This is the quiet place. It's better here." He looked at me, his eyes empty of everything but a strange, placid pity. "You seem worried. You carry a lot of noise with you. You should try the water, doctor. It will wash it all away. You could be peaceful, like us." The invitation, so simple, so gentle, was the most terrifying thing I have ever heard. There was no malice in it. It was the organism's prime directive, spoken through a human mouth. "Join us, become simple, become nothing." I left Silver Sands the next day. I have my data, my samples, my notes. I've written a preliminary report, but I haven't sent it. Who do I send it to? How do I tell the world that a popular tourist beach contains a microscopic, sentient ocean that assimilates human consciousness? They wouldn't close the beach. They would lock me in a padded room. And so I do nothing. I sit in my university office, surrounded by books that explain a world I no longer believe is complete. And I think about that tide pool, glowing faintly under the moon. I think about Mark and Sarah, who are probably still sitting there, or perhaps they've finally wandered off, two more placid souls joining the quiet diaspora of the lost. And I think about the summer that's just beginning, and all the happy vacationers, full of life and plans and love, making their way down to that beautiful, hidden cove, ready for a dip in the calm, clear, waiting water. You just heard a story about a trap. A deliberate man-made horror show built with cameras and scripts by a mind that was, at the end of the day, human. That's a kind of evil you can almost process. It's a monster you can recognize. But the story I have for you is about a different kind of trap, one that wasn't built by anyone, and one that doesn't care about you at all. It was there long before we were, and it will be there long after we're gone. It's a feature of the landscape, as natural as a cliff face, but it is infinitely more dangerous. My name is Dr. Alistair Finch. I'm a marine biologist, not a storyteller, but what I found at Silver Sands doesn't fit in a scientific journal. It belongs here as a warning. My work involves studying life in places that try their best to kill it. I look for the strange, the resilient, the parasitic. So when I came across a statistical cluster of unexplained disappearances and psychotic breaks all centered on the pristine, beautiful coastline of Silver Sands, my professional curiosity was piqued. This wasn't my usual work, but the pattern was too clean. Vacationers, happy couples, college kids on break, they would arrive for a week of paradise, and some of them would simply unravel. They'd be found wandering miles away, placid and unresponsive, with no memory of who they were. The official explanation was always a fugue state, a mental break. But it was happening too often. The locals, fishermen mostly, had their own explanation. They called them the placid ones. They said the ocean sometimes rinses a soul clean and gives you back an empty shell that looks like the person you lost. As a man of science, I dismissed it as folklore. I now believe it's the most terrifyingly accurate description I have ever heard. I set up a small, temporary lab in a rented cottage, my official purpose being to study the unique coastal ecosystem. For weeks, everything was normal. The water chemistry was perfect, the marine life abundant. I was beginning to think the whole thing was a statistical red herring. Then I decided to explore the less traveled parts of the coast, the coves and inlets that were too difficult for the average tourist to reach. That's when I found it. The cove was hidden by a natural labyrinth of sharp, black volcanic rock. You could only access it during the lowest tide of the day. The moment I stepped inside, the world changed. The air was still. The sound of the ocean faded to a distant murmur. The place felt wrong. As a biologist, my senses are trained to look for signs of a healthy ecosystem. This place had none. The rocks were scrubbed clean of life. No barnacles, no sea moss, nothing. The sand was a fine silvery powder, and in the center of the cove was a tide pool, a perfect circle of water about 30 feet in diameter. It was the water that truly unsettled me. It was impossibly clear, like liquid glass. There was no algae, no sediment, not a single fish or crab darting in its depths. An environment this perfect should have been an explosion of life. Its sterility was a paradox. It was like finding a perfectly preserved corpse in the middle of a bustling city. It didn't belong. I was preparing to take a water sample when I heard their laughter. A young couple, I'll call them Chloe and Ben, had managed to find their way into the cove. They were the picture of vibrant, youthful happiness. They saw the pool and reacted with the same awe I had. "It's perfect," Chloe said, her voice echoing slightly in the stillness. Before I could shout a warning, they were wading in. I decided to hold back to observe. They sat in the shallows, the crystalline water lapping at their waists. I watched as the energy seemed to drain from them, replaced by a deep, meditative calm. They stayed for nearly an hour, not speaking, just staring into the water. When they finally left, they walked right past my observation point among the rocks. They didn't see me. They seemed to see nothing at all. Their faces were relaxed, their smiles faint and vacant. They became my case study. The next day, I approached them on the main beach, pretending to be a fellow tourist. They were bright, energetic, and full of plans. They told me about the hike they had planned for the next day, the kayaking trip after that. They were complex, interesting people. They were my baseline. I spoke to them again 2 days later. They had returned to the pool each day. The change was horrifying. The people I had spoken to were gone. Their plans to go hiking were a forgotten memory. "We were going to," Ben said, his voice a soft, uninflected monotone. "But it's so much nicer at the pool. So peaceful." Chloe, who had been so animated before, just smiled. It was a perfect, pleasant, utterly empty smile. Her personality, all her sharp and interesting edges, had been worn smooth. And there were physical changes. A subtle, waxy sheen to their skin, a slight lack of focus in their eyes. They still looked like Chloe and Ben, but they were a flawless, uncanny imitation. The soul, the animating spark, had been extinguished. They were the placid ones. That night I went to the pool. Under the moonlight, I finally saw its secret. The water itself was glowing with a soft internal, milky blue luminescence. It was pulsing very slowly like a sleeping lung. I gathered my sample, my hands shaking, and rushed back to my lab. I am a scientist. I have seen things under a microscope that would defy your imagination. But what I saw in that drop of water will haunt me until the day I die. It was not a bacteria. It was not a virus. It was a network. A vast, interconnected web of crystalline structures, each one pulsing with that same soft, blue light. When I introduced a nutrient, they didn't multiply. They connected. They expanded their network, becoming more complex, more integrated. It was a colonial organism that behaved less like a microbe and more like a liquid brain. The tests I ran over the next few days confirmed my terrifying hypothesis. The organism was a neurological parasite of impossible sophistication. It entered a host through simple skin contact. It didn't consume tissue or blood, it consumed consciousness. It would interface with the host's nervous system, its crystalline structure a perfect mimic for synaptic pathways. It would absorb memories, emotions, ambitions, fears. The entire electrical tapestry of a human personality, as if it were simply downloading a file. And as it absorbed, it replaced. It would flood the host's brain with a powerful cocktail of natural endorphins and inhibitors, erasing the complex personality and substituting it with its own prime directive, a state of blissful, mindless peace. It wasn't killing them, it was editing them. It was taking a rich, complex story, erasing all the words, and leaving behind a beautiful, empty cover. The person you were was gone. The only thing left was a walking, smiling shell, a biological vessel now programmed with a new, simple purpose: stay near the pool and bring others into its peace. This is a horror that science has no name for. It is the loss of the self. Not death, but a quiet, pleasant erasure. What is a person without their memories, their flaws, their messy, beautiful desires? They are nothing, just a body, breathing and smiling, with the lights off inside. I went to see Chloe and Ben one last time. It was the day they were meant to fly home. I found them, of course, sitting by the pool. The tide was coming in, and the waves were beginning to wash into their serene sanctuary. They didn't seem to notice. "You'll miss your flight," I said softly. Chloe turned her head, her movements slow and graceful. Her placid smile didn't falter. "We're not going," she said, her voice like chimes. "This is better. What about your families, your lives?" Ben looked at me, and for the first time I saw an expression in his eyes. It was a faint, clinical pity. "You seem so loud," he said, though I hadn't raised my voice. "Your mind. It's so noisy, full of worry." He gestured to the water. "You should try it, doctor, just for a little while. It will wash all the noise away. You could be quiet. You could be peaceful, just like us." The invitation was not a threat. It was a sincere, gentle offering. It was the organism, speaking through its human puppet, offering me the gift of oblivion. It was the most terrifying moment of my life. I left Silver Sands. I have my notes, my samples locked in a cryogenic freezer. But what can I do? Who do I tell? How do I explain that one of the country's most beautiful vacation spots is home to a parasitic, hive-mind intelligence that assimilates human souls? They wouldn't quarantine the beach, they would quarantine me. So I am telling you. The storyteller, the traveler, the person looking for a week of peace. The tide pool at Silver Sands is still there. Under the warm summer sun, its water is still clear, calm, and impossibly beautiful. It is waiting. It doesn't have to hunt. It just has to wait for you to come, tired of the noise of your own life, and offer you the simple, silent, horrifying peace of becoming nothing at all.